To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 11. Here we meet Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose. Dubose. Miss Henry Lafayette Dubose is the old lady down the street, crazy old lady down the street, who yells at kids. Uh, she is in a wheelchair and she carries a CSA pistol, or the rumor is that she carries a CSA pistol. CSA pistol is a Confederate States of America pistol, so again, a Civil War reference, and it's concealed among her numerous shawls and wraps, and she's willing to shoot anybody with it. So Scout narrates that often she would, when they would pass, she would say, "Hey, Mr. DeBose," and Miss DeBose would respond, "Don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl," and then give her opinion of Atticus. Besides being the sassiest, most disrespectful mutts who ever passed her way, we were told that it was quite a pity our father had not remarried after our mother's death. A lovelier lady than our mother never lived, she said, and it was heartbreaking the way Atticus Finch let her children run wild. Scout and Jim would relate their dealings with Mrs. Dubose to Atticus, and Atticus would tell them, she's an old lady, she's ill, just hold your head high and be a gentleman. So the day after Jim's 12th birthday, Jim has gotten some money, and they're going to they're heading to town. And Miss DuBois, again, is the lady that lives at the end of the street on their way to town. And she would yell at them anytime they passed, and walking on the other side of the street would just make her yell louder. So it's the day after his 12th birthday. He is going to buy a miniature steam engine and for himself, and a baton for Scout. Miss DuBose is rearing up that day. She yells insults at him. There are six that she yells, at least six that she yells. And here they are. Where are you two going at this time of day? Playing hooky, I suppose? I'll just call up the principal and tell him. And Jim responds, it's Saturday. Makes no difference if it's Saturday. I wonder if your father knows where you are. And then, that was 1, 2. After Jim responds that they've been going to town since they were knee high. Don't you lie to me, Jeremy Finch. Marty Atkinson told me you broke down her Scoopernog arbor this morning. She's going to tell your father, and then you'll wish you never saw the light of day. If you aren't sent to reform school before next week, my name's not DuBose. So 2, 3. What are you doing and this is directed towards Scout. What are you doing in those overalls? You should be in a dress and camisole, young lady. You'll grow up waiting tables if nobody doesn't change your ways. A Finch waiting on tables at the OK Cafe. Ha! 3, 4. Not only a Finch waiting on tables, but one in the courthouse lawn for niggers. 5. Your father's no better than the niggers in the trash he works for. 6. Half of the Finches were in the asylum anyway. So 6 things that she sort of yells at them as they're walking past. And this gets to Scout, or not Scout, this gets to Jim somehow. And when they're on the way back from town after buying the steam engine and the baton, he takes the baton and cuts the top off of every camellia bush Miss DuBose owns, and she's really famous for her flowers, her camellia flowers. He knocks them to the ground until there's nothing but green buds and leaves left. And so when they go home, of course, they wait for Atticus. Atticus comes in. His voice is described as being like winter winds, and he sends Jim down to Miss DuBose to talk and to apologize. And then while he's down there, Scout and Atticus talk, and we get this is like lesson 11 in this book. Atticus says to Scout, when summer comes, When summer comes, you'll have to keep your head high, your head about far worse. About they're talking about holding your head up high. It's not fair for you and Jim, I know, but sometimes we have to make the best of things. And the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down, well, all I can say is when you and Jim are grown, maybe look back on this with some compassion. So, this idea that when the chips are down, that's when your conduct matters more than any other. Lesson number 11. And then you get lesson number 12. Scott asks why they have to keep their heads on right, and you know, she says, Atticus, you must be wrong. How's that? Why, most folks seem to think you're right, they're right, and you're wrong. And Atticus responds, they're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to full respect for their opinions. But before I can live with other folks, I got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. So you got to listen to your own conscience first before you can listen to somebody else. When Jim returns, he tells Atticus that Miss DeBose wants him to read to her out loud every day after school and on Saturdays for 2 hours. And he asks if he has to do this. Atticus says, yes, certainly. Jim says, but for a month. Then you'll do it for a month. And the book he starts to read her is a book called Ivanhoe. And Ivanhoe is by Sir Walter Scott. We'll talk about that as far as an illusion here at the end of this chapter. Then when they go over, we get a description of Miss DeBose lying in her bed. She was horrible. Her face was the color of a dirty pillowcase, and the corners of her mouth glistened with wet, which inched like a glacier down the deep grooves enclosing her chin. Old age liver spots dotted her cheeks, and her pale eyes had black pinpoint pupils. Her hands were knobby, and the cuticles were grown up over her fingernails. Her bottom plate was not in, and her upper lip protruded. From time to time, she would draw her nether lip to her upper plate and carry her chin with it. This made the wet move faster. And, as they read, as Jim read along, Scout notices that Mrs. DeBose's corrections, because she starts, when Jim begins reading, she corrects every word that he skips over or mispronounces. And then as he goes along, the corrections grew fewer and farther between, and that she notices that Miss DeBose was not even listening. And then the alarm clock goes off. Jesse, the servant, the African-American servant, says, it's time for medicine, and then they send Scout and Jim home. There's a pattern that Scout notices that happens. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Everything would begin normally. That is, Miss DeBose would hound Jim for a while on her favorite subjects, her camellias and our father's nigger-loving propensities. She would grow increasingly silent, then go away from us. The alarm clock would ring. Jesse would shoo us out, and the rest of the day was ours. And then in between some of these readings, we have Scout talking to Atticus. You get like lesson number 13. Scout wants to know about what nigger means, since she's been hearing it so much. And she says it's not the word itself, but the way the word is used. And she asked Atticus if he's a nigger lover. She says, you aren't really a nigger lover then, are you? I certainly am. I do my best to love everyone. I'm hard put sometimes, baby. It's never an insult to be called what someone thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you, so don't let Miss DeBose get you down. She has enough troubles of her own. So, insults never really hurt you, particularly if it's a bad name or something that someone else thinks is a bad name, because it's just a word. So he's trying to say, don't listen to it, and it's not going to hurt you if someone else calls you something that they think is a bad name. And then we get to one afternoon, a month later, a month after the reading, uh, Atticus shows up. Um, and we have Scout reading Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, and Mr. Bowes correcting him at every turn. Then there comes a knock on the door, and she says, "Come in." And Scout realizes, "It suddenly came to me that each day we had been staying a little bit longer at Mrs. DeBoe's. The alarm clock went off a few minutes later every day, and that she was well into one of her fits by the time it sounded. Today she had antagonized Jim for nearly 2 hours with no intention of having a fit, and I felt hopelessly trapped." Um, and then it comes and she asks, Jim to stay for another week just to make sure that everything is fine. And then one afternoon she says, "That's all. Good day to you," and that's it. And then we learn from Atticus, uh, you know, it becomes, spring, summer's coming on. Atticus goes down to Miss DeBoe's house one day and comes back saying that she has died. And then tells the kids, Jim and Scott, Miss DeBoe's was a morphine addict. She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctor put her on it. She'd spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary. She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt if she ever heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on that alarm clock. And then she leaves Jim, a box of camellia flowers called "Snow on the Mountain." Um, and Atticus says, "I think that was her way of telling you everything's all right now, Jim. Everything's all right. She was a great lady. I wanted you to see something about her." And Atticus says that he was going to have him read to her, even if he hadn't done what he did. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is. Instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but begin anyway, and you see through it no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. So the lesson number 14, courage is not a man with a gun in his hand, but courage is when you know you're licked, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. Note there's a relationship also to that back to the court case that Atticus has taken. He knows he's already licked before he started. So this is the lesson of courage, lesson 14. So let's talk about some illusions here. You got the illusions of the pistol, the CSA pistol, the Confederate States of America pistol. You also have it being referred to as the Confederate relic. Again, going back to the Civil War, slavery, the inherent slavery in the system. You also have the book Ivanhoe, which is romantic literature of high adventure. And in this book, you have King Richard, Robin Hood, knights, etc. It was a book really to try to take Mr. Bose's mind off of the drug. There's a contrast between the romantic nature of Ivanhoe and the serious nature of the drug that she's trying to kick. You also have allusions to Lafayette, Mrs. Henry DeBose, Miss Henry Lafayette DeBose. Lafayette is probably her maiden name, and Lafayette is a noble aristocratic French name, the House of Lafayette. It also is allusion to the General Lafayette in the American Revolution. He is the young French general that becomes friends with George Washington. And of course, when you think about the Revolutionary War, you think about this idea of overcoming tyranny and this idea of freedom. And really what she's trying to overcome is a tyranny of this addiction and freedom from it. And then we get some symbols here. You got the symbol of the big symbol is the camellias themselves, the flowers that Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose grows, and the camellias actually have many symbols. It symbolizes many things, but one is overcoming obstacles. Overcoming, again, is reoccurring like sort of theme throughout the book. It's also adoration and mourning. So the adoration, it comes here, perhaps for Jim helping her, but also perhaps for Attica's adoration of what she stood for. And the mourning comes for, of course, that she's dead at the end of the chapter. Um, you have a series of lessons here. Lesson 11, how we conduct ourselves when the chips are down is what is important. Lesson 12, before we can live with other people, we need to live with ourselves, in our own conscience. 13, insults. You shouldn't really listen to the insults of others. What does it matter whether someone calls you a name? And 14, what is courage? Well, courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through. So no matter what, that is courage. I mean, if you know that you're going to lose and you give up before you start, well, who cares, right? But if you know you're going to lose and you continue to fight, that is what courage is. All right, some themes here. Two big themes. One, the appearance versus reality. Mrs. DeBose is more than what she seems to be. She seems to be this crazy old prejudiced lady at the end of the street that taunts and yells at kids. But a lot of that is some of that is the addiction to morphine. Some of that is, of course, is her personality. But there's more there. She is a noble lady, aristocratic lady, and she is courageous. I mean, the wanting to kick something that relieves pain and going through the withdrawal symptoms, even though she knows she's going to die, is something courageous. And also the meaning of duty. The meaning of duty here, Atticus has a duty again to the neighborhood. So he puts Jim, and sends Jim to read to Miss DeVos because she needs somebody, and that's what neighbors do. All right, that is chapter 11. Tomorrow we will talk about an overview of part 1. I hope that helps. Okay, see you tomorrow.